This is Lauren Kimball for ANI 150, and welcome to part 2 of the painting the textures for our can tutorial. Alright, so in the last tutorial we went ahead and created this custom label for our food can, and we also have this little expiration date up here. If we turn on the background element and we turn on the guide, you can see that this expiration date info is going to show up on the bottom of the food can. And over here we can see where the label is going to be outstretched on the side of the food can. Now, before we export this, make sure that the guide and the background are turned off. And we're going to begin by just making this available in a format that Substance Painter is going to like. So again, turn off background, turn off guide. If you don't, these guidelines are going to show up in your texture when you import it. So what you want to do is just go to File, and we want to go to Export, and Quick Export as a PNG works. Remember, PNG we like because it is a lossless format. And I'm just going to call this can label underscore color. So the reason we want to call it color is because we're going to be coming back to this file and we're going to export different channel maps. So we'll talk more on that in a minute. All you need to know right now is can label color is what we're naming it, and save it in a place that's easy to find. You could save it to your desktop, or you could go into your exercise file. And I would recommend saving it in either the images or the source images folder. We're not bringing it into Maya per se, so you could save it there. Or if you'd want to maybe think about taking it into Maya later, you put it in the source images folder. I'm just going to save it to the desktop just so it's easy to find. Oops. Color label PNG desktop. Save. All right, so if I minimize my screen, oops, got Substance Painter open. So if you have Substance Painter open, you can click close on that window and minimize it. And there we go, we got our can label color, and there's my can label Photoshop document. Perfect. All right, let's go ahead and pop Substance back open. So right here we have the interface for Substance Painter where we're going to be texturing the can's material and also bringing that label in. To begin, I want you to go File, New, and then this window will pop up. By default, it's going to say Select Template. Templates just tell Substance Painter the kind of channels and the kind of mesh maps we want. So depending on the project, you might want to paint different attributes. For this class, we're basically going to be sticking to a PBR workflow. So PBR stands for Physical Based Rendering, and it's essentially the industry standard. So the very first template, ASM, stands for Adobe Standard Material. PBR Metallic Roughness worked just fine. Go ahead and click on that. The next one is, the next option in the new project menu is the File Select. And this is where we're going to bring in the actual 3D asset. Now, previously, you should have already modeled your 3D can, both the high poly version and the low poly version. The one that we're going to bring in is the low poly can. Now, we can't just bring in a Maya file. We need an FBX file. So hopefully, from class or from our previous tutorial, you know to go ahead and export the high poly and the low poly as FBX files. Also, make sure that you have your well, obviously, if you did the can label, you have your UVs laid out on the low poly can. So I'm going to click Select, and it's already in my Scenes folder for my food can, and there is the Can Low FBX. Let's go ahead and open it. And it says Project Settings. We're going to change this from 1024 to 2040 to match our texture tile resolution. Normal map format, let's go with OpenGL. That just has to do with how the normals are going to be read. Since we're working in Maya, OpenGL would be ideal. If we were working in a different game engine, we might go back and change this. If you do retroactively change your normal map format, remember that you'll have to rebake your maps. That may not make sense right now, but as we get into it, it'll make more sense. Next is compute tangent space per fragment. That has more to do with game engines. Because at JUCO we like to use Unreal Engine, we're going to stick with keeping compute tangent space per fragment on. If we were going to use Unity, we might consider turning that off. Next, UV tile settings UDIMs. We talked about this earlier in class. A UDIM workflow is when you use multiple texture tiles. For this assignment, we're going to use one texture tile. We will touch on using UDIMs for our project one, but generally speaking, using one texture tile is still pretty industry standard. So you leave this unchecked. Don't import cameras, don't auto unwrap. We've already taken care of those things in Maya. So this should be the ideal settings for moving forward. And then press OK. And voila, we have our can. Now, as far as rotating, translating, zooming in and out, those hotkeys are going to be the same as what you've experienced in Maya. So you're going to hold down Alt and you'll right mouse click, middle mouse click, or left mouse click in order to navigate your mesh. Now this is just 3D view only. 3D view can be accessed by pressing F3. If I press F2, oh, I got them mixed up. This is F2. F3 shows you your flat UV space, or the 2D. If you want to see both, you got to press F1. And this is typically the default, seeing a split screen. But if you don't want your full scene populated by both at the same time, just remember F1, F2, F3, and back to F1 again. All right? So over here, we have your toolbar on the far left side. You can activate the different tools numerically by pressing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. See how different tools are being selected in the toolbar? Very easy to remember. It's all just numerical value. Number 1, of course, is your paintbrush tool. Number 2 is your eraser. The third one is projections, and we're not going to really play with that until project 1. Next, you have polygon fill, and that kind of acts like if you wanted to select very specific faces to fill. Over here, we've got our smudge tool, if you wanted to smudge some of the texture that you're painting. We have a clone tool, very helpful for covering seams. And we've got a material picker tool, which works just like the color drop tool, only it samples full materials as opposed to just colors. All right, everything down here we're just not going to worry about right now. This has to do with Substance Painter's website and downloading resources from Substance. Over here we have the Assets menu, and the Assets menu is just all the sort of pre-loaded materials and assets that exist in your scene if you wanted to use them. Over to the right of that, so you see all these little tabs. These kind of show you the different libraries. So this first one are just your base materials. Over here are smart materials. So let me show you the difference between those real quick. If I were to grab just this aluminum material and drag it onto my mesh, you can see that it is just a pure single material, right? It's right there. It shows up in our layers menu. We can turn it on and off with visibility. I'm going to delete it. Let's go ahead and juxtapose that to this aluminum, which is a smart material. When you use a smart material, as you can see, it's a little different in the layers tab. There's a folder attached as opposed to just being a single standalone layer. If we click on this folder, you'll see that a smart material has multiple assets inside, like not assets, but options like layers. So maybe you'll have fill layers or painted layers, or you'll have something like levels attached, or channel maps, or there's a lot of things that could be layered to create the effect of the brushed aluminum. And both the standard aluminum and the brushed aluminum here, both of them are equally awesome. It's just whatever your output is that you're trying to achieve. And you don't have to stick with the defaults. If there's things that you like about this, like let's say I really like this brushed aluminum, but I want it to be a different color, you can actually go in and mess with what's inside this folder. Like if I click on the scratches, I can see that it's a roughness map, and I could go in and make adjustments to the parameters here. Remember, sometimes maps are an actual image, and other times it's a material that has preset options that you can tweak. So I could like up the contrast and see how that affects things. I can play with the brush pattern. I can change the balance. So there's kind of cool things that you can change there. The aluminum base appears to be a color, height, rough, and metal map, and normal map. All these channels are turned on. I'm going to go over here and click on base color and change it to a blue. And now my aluminum is a different color. So you can go ahead and explore the settings in a smart material. They're really just a default launching off place. Sometimes what you get is what you like, and that's totally cool. More power to you if you don't have to change a bunch of things, but I would encourage you to kind of explore the settings. Remember, up here, this is the layers menu. This is where everything's going to live that you apply to your mesh. And down here, these are your properties that tell you what is happening on that layer. So you can, let's go ahead and just create a layer real quick. Let's go with a paint layer. So remember the type of layer, oh, let's get rid of the brushed aluminum. The type of layer that you create is determined by what you push up here. So obviously these last two aren't layers. The last two are delete and create folder. But then you've got your effects. So you can add effects just like you would do in Photoshop. Over here you have mask layers, which we'll talk about later. Over here you've got a paint layer that you could just go in and paint based on what your property settings are. A fill layer will fill the mesh entirely with just whatever you choose to fill it with. And over here, you've got the add a preset layer, and that will just take you directly to the shortcut layer over here of the Smart Materials. Okay. Now, anything you want to change is addressed in the Properties menu. So this is the Properties menu for a paintable layer. You can see you can adjust the brush flow and the type of brush that you're going to paint with. And all those settings are within this first box. So these boxes here allow you to just scroll down quickly through the settings. Or you could just grab the scroll bar and see what all the different settings are. So the first one has to do with your brush. The second has to do with alphas. So alphas are black and white images that dictate the shape your brush is going to paint in. So we have a default brush selected and it's just a nice round image. If you want to check out other alphas, you can go over here in the library, and about 5 buttons over, you have default brushes that you can select. Now, all brushes and virtually all software packages are dependent on alphas. Alphas are just a fancy way of saying a black and white image, and grayscale. So everything that's black is considered turned off, and everything white is the actual shape of the brush. Of course, you can get different outputs if you choose something more grayscale. A little hard to see with that one. Maybe this would be better. Yeah, so you can see that there's a little bit more texture implied. So you can actually build your own custom alphas if you want, just by importing an alpha shape that you pull out of Photoshop. But for right now, it's just fun to play with the existing ones. So I'm just going to go back to a basic hard. And that is what you would do if you want to change the parameters of the alpha. Or I'm sorry, the shape of the alpha, the actual brush shape. Now remember, whichever brush you choose, you can actually go up here and play with the settings of how that's used. So for example, if I want more spacing, I can give this more of a polka dot feel. If I have something like, what's a good one? Let's choose something with a little more form to it. Yeah, like these leaves. Look at these curved leaves. So if I go in here and I add spacing, it kind of adds more of a scattered leaf effect. Let's take that back down to its default, or close to its default. Let's delete this and create a new layer. If I want to, I could also adjust the angle. And you can see here in the sample box in the properties how that's changing. So if I change the angle here, it doesn't quite look as good. They also have what are called jitters. Jitters are just ways of randomizing your brush. So let's go back to a base. There's the hard base again. Let's delete this and create a new one. All right, if I had size jitter turned on all the way, then as I'm drawing, the brush is constantly growing and shrinking randomly. There's flow jitter, which has to do with kind of the opacity of the brush. Angle jitter, which you're not going to notice a big difference here because it's a rounded brush, but if I were to create a new paint layer and choose something with more shape to it, like the leaf brush we had, or, oh, there it is, the leaf curve. So if I add an angle jitter to this is what the angle jitter looks like, and this is turning off the angle jitter where everything's just following the path. Follow path right here is turned on. That means that wherever you are painting is the direction the brush is going to, or the texture is going to follow as well. This would change completely if I turn that off. If I turn that off, then it's not the brush that leads it so much as the initial stroke. If you find that all confusing, I encourage you to just explore it yourself. The more you practice it, the more you're going to feel more confident in using the tools. The big thing to remember is that jitter means randomization. So if you want to randomize how things are looking, play with the jitters. Up here, size, flow, stroke, spacing, stroke opacity rather. These are all pretty self-explanatory, but yeah, play with them. If you don't like the outcome, you can always reset the brush by reselecting it. If you like an outcome, you can save a brush, but we'll talk about that later. For right now, just play with the defaults. All right, let's scroll down to parameters, or I'm sorry, so this is the alpha and all the parameters for the alpha that you can change. Over here, we go to stencil, and we're not going to touch on stencils right now. There's a whole tutorial that covers stenciling in Project 1, but what stencil does is you're able to like superimpose an actual stencil over your screen and paint a design on. And then the last one is the material that you're painting. Remember, by default, you're painting on multiple channels. Okay, so what does that mean? If I were to go over here into my 3D view, and let's just make that our full view for a second. Pressing M on your keyboard shows you the material, meaning all the channel maps, all the bake maps together. But if we were to press on B, we could toggle, and you see over here the different mesh maps. There are no mesh maps painted right now, so you're going to see either alpha channels, which are indicated by the gray and white, meaning that it's transparent, there's nothing there. Or you're going to see on or off, gray or purple or white, just a blank canvas, because we don't have any mesh maps. Substance Painter works using two types of textures: mesh maps, channel maps. Mesh maps you bake, channel maps. If you want to look at your channel maps, you just press C, and you can look through base, color, height, roughness, metallic, normal and height map. You don't really paint normal maps, it's just showing you the normal maps that are generated by painting a height map. Okay, so I would largely avoid, or not avoid, kind of ignore the normal map unless you're painting a height map. All right, so it's a little hard to understand or appreciate those maps without actually seeing something in Substance Painter that already has them. So I'm going to go ahead and click open, and I'm going to find, let's see, there we go, can demo I did for the previous tutorial. There we go. So this one already has my texture map on there of the label, and it's got some aluminum and some dirt. So if I click M, you see the entire texture as it should look in its finished composite. If I type B for baked map, this is an ID map. I don't have one, so it's just red. ID maps are optional. They're a way for you to stay organized if you want. ID maps just color code things. Not every map that's baked is necessarily something you're going to use. Ambient occlusion is a very important map. We talked about this in class, but ambient occlusion is essentially the type of shadow that's created from crevices, because light is a particle, and when it hits something, it bounces. Whenever there's a corner in the room or a corner on an object, any sort of crevice, light has a hard time hitting, and it creates a default shadow called an ambient occlusion. So in a nutshell, all you have to know about ambient occlusion maps is they're black and white, and they're created by being dark around crevices and light around open surfaces. They're really awesome for adding an extra level of depth to your texture. Curvature maps, not super important for this assignment, but a curvature map is like an ambient occlusion map, but it just adds a little bit more depth. Position map is important for Substance Painter. A position map is going to tell Substance Painter what's up, what's down, what's side to side. So not necessarily something that you're going to be exporting, but something that's very helpful to bake for Substance Painter to understand. Thickness map just kind of indicates the thickness of the 3D mesh. Also not super important for these assignments. Height map, if you bake one, and one didn't pop out here, is essentially just a black and white version of showing depth. Bent normals, I'm going to just kind of skip through the ones that we're not going to use. Instead of explaining all of these, let's just talk about, I think it's better if we just start from the beginning and talk about the important maps. So I'm going to press B. You can see these are all the bake maps. There's a lot of them. The only ones that you really need to worry about baking are going to be your normal map. So that's this one here, the world space normal. This is going to be very important to bake, and the regular normal map. You're going to need to know the position map because that's helpful for Substance Painter. And the other map that I really want you to care about is the ambient occlusion map. So just having your normal maps, your ambient occlusion map, and your position map, that's all you really need to worry about. You can kind of ignore the other ones because we're not going to be using them for this assignment. The channel maps, if I press C, you can see the different channels. They're up here, and they exist as base color, height, roughness, metallic. And the normal height aren't really channels that you're painting. They're kind of generated by the height map. You can kind of ignore these unless you have a special brush that paints normal maps. The ones I want you to worry about are base color, height, roughness, metallic. Okay? Color, height, roughness, metallic. You can look at these two, but don't stress them. And then, of course, the mesh maps, normal maps. So you got your normal and your world space normals. And you want to worry about your position and your ambient occlusion. Okay, I know that's a lot of information, but the best thing to remember, allow Substance Painter to take care of the details for baking maps. As for your main focus once the maps are baked is the channel maps, so narrow your focus down to just these four. Base color, height, roughness, metallic. And the metallic's really easy, so really you're just focusing on these three. Anyway, if you want to look through these maps, you just tap C, and you see how each one looks a little different. And then if I want to look through my baked maps, it's B. And then if I want to look at everything together, it is M. All right? So the best way to kind of learn these maps, if you're feeling overwhelmed, is to just jump in. As you start to create these maps, it's going to become more intuitive and more understanding. Right now, I just told you what the maps are, and hearing someone describe the maps isn't as helpful as putting your hands on them and really seeing in real time what they are doing and how the information on each of these maps is contributing to the overall look of your asset. So let's go ahead and jump back into the can, the new one. So I closed out of it without saving, so this is a good review. If you're starting to bring your can in, we're going to go to PBR Metallic Roughness. It's the first one. We're going to go ahead and load our low poly. Remember, high poly is only for baking. We grab the low poly. Then we change the document resolution to match our textures. We change this to OpenGL. We leave one. And everything else should be unchecked and okay. Just discard the previous can. And here we are back to square one. Let's begin texturing our can. All right, to begin, we're going to want to start with our mesh maps because the low poly can doesn't show us where the lip of the high poly can is, all the details of the high poly can. If you remember from the previous tutorial, the model that actually looks like a high poly can, or actually, sorry, the model that actually looks like a can is the high poly. But when we're working in a game engine, we don't have the same allowance as far as the amount of faces and the resolution of our mesh. So in order to get around that, we take a low poly mesh like this one and we fake all of those details by baking mesh maps. So to do that, we go over here to our texture set settings, and this is going to look a little different based on what version of Substance Painter you're using. In the more advanced version of Substance Painter, there's a map baking view, and then there's the painter view. So we're in the painter view. I'm not sure if this version has the map painter view. Let me see. Oh, no, that's render view. Go away. Go away. Sorry, I definitely have the older version. So in the newer version, there's a new window now for baking your maps. And actually, maybe I used the wrong hotkey. Nope, I definitely don't have it. So it's toggling between, I believe, F8 and F9 for going between the two different views. Let's see. Yeah, I don't see that. Oh, here we go. Yeah, so over here under mode, you can see there's a painting mode and a rendering mode, which we will talk about rendering in class next week. But if you have a newer version of Painter, there's an additional mode for baking maps. You can do the same workflow that I'm doing here, but the window's position might be a little bit different. So just be aware of that. Over here under texture set settings, which should be the same on both versions of Substance Painter, you're going to be able to see all the channel maps available to you based on the specific template we're working on. So as a PBR workflow, we have our base color, height, roughness, metallic, and we do have a normal map channel. The normal map, just so that you're clear, there's a painted version of the normal map channel and there's a baked one. We're really more interested in the baked version, but just be aware that there is one you could technically paint on. We're going to leave all of this stuff alone, and we're going to jump down here to mesh maps. These are all the possible mesh maps you could bake. We're going to click on the Bake Mesh Maps button. Now, for those of you working an older version of Substance Painter, this is going to be the only thing that pops up. For others, there's going to be like a menu here, and then you're going to have, let's see, oh, it's not letting me toggle the mesh with that open. You're going to want to go over here. Okay, so in the newer version, you'd see the mesh over here, and you would see the cage that goes around it. So what's a cage? A cage is like an invisible mesh that determines how far rays are going to go to bake your map. Oh boy, that must be so confusing for you all. When you are baking a texture map, you are essentially sending rays from the camera onto the mesh. They're bouncing around and they're trying to figure out where the mesh is, where the details are between the high poly and the low poly mesh. If that's super confusing, don't stress it. Just know that if you see an invisible mesh, like it won't be perfectly invisible, it'll be like a semi, have a semi opacity to it, like a semi-transparent mesh surrounding your main mesh. That's just a preview of the cage that tells you how deep it's going to be baking its rays. Okay, that's all that does. Don't be freaked out by it. It didn't change your project. When you close out of the baking mode, those will disappear. All right? For everyone else, just follow along with these settings and you'll see exactly what I see if you don't have the newer version. So output size, we're going to change that to 2048 to match our texture area. You can kind of ignore this for now. We're going to go over here and click high definition meshes. See how it says here we're doing the high poly parameters? There's two options here. You can use low poly mesh as a high poly. So if you already have a detailed low poly mesh, you could just use that detailed low poly mesh to generate these maps. Instead, I want my high poly mesh, so we're going to click this button here, and we're going to select our Can High FBX and open. Let's go down. We're not going to worry about a cage. That's a little bit more it's a little bit more advanced to talk about how to save cages. None of the meshes that we're going to be building at this time are going to be so complex that they require a cage. So we're not going to make things more muddled by explaining that right now. All right, well, let's just leave all the default settings alone so we can show you what's going to be baked. So let's go bake selected textures. All right, so here are the defaults. And it's a bit messy because it just didn't bake very cleanly. Let's go back here. If you end up having a whole bunch of maps where it feels like it's somewhat broken, it's just the depth of the bake wasn't sufficient. We're going to have to increase the distance of these rays. Let's change it from 0.01 to 0.1. The reason we start out low is because the more you increase the distance of the rays that are determining this, the slower it goes. So that's why we kind of work up to figure out how deep we need to make things. Let's try again. Oh, that looks so much better. Now you'll notice there's this waviness going on. That waviness is caused by this option right here, averaging normals. Let's turn that off and bake again. Oh, that's better. The waviness is gone. And that bake looks pretty good. Now, yes, there's still going to be some angles on this can. It's not going to completely hide or obscure that it's a low poly mesh. We could fix that if the budget allows for more faces. We could up the resolution of the low poly can to get a smoother output. But this assignment, just leaving it as it is just fine. And there we go. That's what it looks like to have your maps baked. If you are in the special version of Substance Painter where they open a brand new window, just press F9 to bring you back to the painted view, just like I'm in. Okay? And remember, F1, F2, and F3 will change the viewport. I was in F2 there for a bit to explain the map baking process. But if you have different viewports, there's nothing wrong with that. All right, and that's what the baked maps look like. And you can see all the baked maps over here as they show up. Again, not all of them are necessary. If you want to get rid of some, you can click the little X, for instance, and that gets rid of that loud red ID map. But it's just you don't really have to do that. Just know that there are maps over here for you. And then these are the channels we're painting. All right, let's go back to our layers menu. I'm gonna actually reset my workspace real quick. If you ever need to, if you lose something, like say you accidentally close out of properties and you need to bring it back, go ahead and reset your UI. The reason I reset my UI is I noticed the texture set list was gone and I wanted to touch on that. The texture set list isn't going to have a huge play in this particular tutorial, but in the future when you do project 1, every time you add a different shader in Maya, like let's say you use Lamberts and you had like 10 Lamberts on your mesh, you could see the master list of all the different materials you add, and you can turn on and off visibility of those different pieces, different shader sets. I won't recommend texturing everything in Lamberts. I just threw that out there as an example. Again, it might not make sense to you yet. And if that's the case, not a problem. There is value in repetition, so that's why I'm pointing this out. If in this instance we only have one material on this can, so don't worry about it. All right, so now that we have our baked map set, I would recommend saving. So I'm gonna just go click save, and I'll call this can demo. Well, for me, it's a demo. For you, you could call it your food can, or no, let's just make that easier. I'll just call it my food can and save. All right, so now that we've taken care of the baked maps, let's start talking about building a texture on this can with our channel maps. This is where it gets fun. I want to go ahead and begin with the smart materials. If I click this second button over here, I can see all my smart materials. And I think because this is an aluminum can, I'm just going to drag and drop the smart layer for the aluminum can. Cool. So that just gives me a base to start with. Now, inside of the layers menu, there's a default layer. I'm going to get rid of it because I'm not using it. And all I see now is this brushed aluminum. And if I want to, I could go through and change some of the settings. Now, right here, I wanted to point this drop-down menu out. This is only showing you the preview of the base colors. You can also look through like heights and see the thumbnails for the height maps that are painted, the roughness maps that are painted. You can also go over here and press C to see that. I just want to tell you what that drop-down menu indicates. Generally, you're going to leave it on base color. So right now I've got aluminum on my can. Great. I think that I'm just going to leave this. I like it as it is. If you want to edit and change it, you certainly can, or you could explore the other smart materials, or you could layer materials. There's so many opportunities and options. The thing I want to focus on next is learning how to bring our label that we made in Photoshop into our file. So the first thing I want to do is load the file into Substance Painter to begin with, so that Substance Painter knows where it is and what it is. So over here on the Assets menu, at the very bottom, there's a plus sign. If you click that, it says Import Resources. So I'm going to say Add Resource, and I'm looking for the can label color. All right? And I'm going to click Open. Next, you'll see it listed there in the Resources menu, and it's going to ask you what it is. Is it an alpha? Is it an environment, a color lute? Just make it a texture. It is a texture. All right, import your resources to current session and import. All right, so under the textures is where you will find your can label hanging out. All right, so now that we know where it is, we're going to go to our layers menu and we're going to create a fill layer. Remember, fill layers are layers that fill the entire texture tile. We are going to go down here under the fill properties and we're looking for the base color. All right, I'm going to click on that and I'm going to type the name can into the search. And there it is, can label color. Click it. And ta-da! The label has shown up on the can just as we painted it within Photoshop to line up with our UVs. Now you can retroactively adjust this by just moving or rotating it, but, oh, did I just crash it? No, I didn't. Let's see, there. But generally speaking, using your UVs, you should be able to just get this right the first time. I would not recommend, not recommend moving it in this view because we're going to be loading up different texture maps and all these texture maps are going to be aligned to these UVs. So if you really want to move your label, wait until all your maps are loaded in and I'll show you how to do that. Now, if I look at my can, so I press F2, you'll notice that the label has the same textures as the can, and actually it seems like it changes and hides some of the aluminum. What's going on with that? Why is it changing so much? Click on your fill layer. Let's go ahead and name it real quick. Remember, we're going to call this label dash color, very important. In the fill, you'll see that we loaded the color, but all these other channels are being affected. The height, the rough, the metal, the normal. Turn those off. And now we see that only the color channel is being affected, which looks really cool for color, but it does have a weird aluminum texture on the label still. So to make our label feel like a paper label, we're going to have to make some changes within Photoshop and export different channels. So I know this is all so confusing if you've never done this before, but hopefully as we progress and actually make these changes, it'll start to click for you. For right now, we have the can label. Actually, we're just gonna start calling this label color. Let's just call this our food label. I just realized I was going to originally teach you all to upload these as separate fill layers, but I think I'm just going to make it one layer. And if it's all one layer, you absolutely can move it if you feel so inclined. So you can kind of ignore what I said before. I beg pardon. I'm not trying to confuse you all. It's just sometimes I change my mind on the fly. So if you want to budge this, you certainly can. I wouldn't recommend it because it can be confusing, but it shouldn't affect how we import these other labels because we're going to put them all on the same fill layer. Okay, so if any of what I just said wasn't helpful and you're confused, just ignore it. Just ignore that part. It's me thinking out loud. All right, so we got our color. This is what you should know. What you should know is we have created a fill label. We named that fill label food color. We went down to the materials, activated, color was activated, and we loaded in the color map there. Now we want to go ahead and address the roughness and the metal map. We're not so much worried about the height map right now, but let's worry about roughness and metal to start things off. I'm going to go ahead and click on Photoshop. And what I want to do is create a roughness map that makes this look more like paper and less like metal. Let's quickly go back to Substance Painter and look at the existing roughness map. Remember, you just press 2 to look at, oh, actually, no, let's leave it in split view. Tap C until you get to roughness. And there is our roughness map. So roughness map is a map that is always grayscale. It can be solid black, it can be solid white, it can be gray. All right, so roughness maps essentially are describing the reflectivity of a surface. All right, the reflectivity of the surface. So if I were to create a new fill layer, and you don't have to do this, this is just a watch, and I'm going to turn off color, high, normal. I'm only controlling the roughness. All right, go to M for material and watch how changing the roughness affects the can. If I turn it black, it becomes very, very reflective, very shiny. If I turn it white, it becomes very matte, meaning there's no reflectivity. So black is a smooth surface. The smoother the surface, the less light bounces around. You get a very clear reflection. The higher the roughness, meaning like maybe not overtly obvious, maybe it's on a more microscopic level, it means the surface has a certain roughness to it that doesn't allow light to bounce as easily back, and it causes less reflection. Essentially, that's why it's called the roughness map. So all you need to really know is that if the roughness map is black, it's shiny. If it's white, then it's matte, and gray is anywhere between. Okay? So hopefully that made sense. I'm going to get rid of this fill layer and go back to the defaults. So how do we take this label and translate it rather into a roughness map? Well, we're going to use something called, so let's go in here, and down here at the bottom you see these this black and white circle. These are called adjustment layers, and if you forget that, you can hover and a little layer will pop up. Like if you forget which one of these is your adjustment layers, it's this one. So adjustment layers allow you to adjust your image within the layer menu in a way that's non-destructive. Okay? So to begin, I want you to create a hue and saturation adjustment menu. And I'm going to leave these on top of everything so that, you know, everything underneath is affected. Okay? So it's best to keep these at the very top. You adjust the adjustment layer through the properties. So if I have like the date layer selected, these are just the default properties of a standard layer. If I click the hue saturation layer, these options appear. And I'm able to adjust the color, the lightness, and the saturation. Drag the saturation all the way to the left, and it will make everything grayscale. What's really cool about these properties or these adjustment layers is if I turn the visibility off, there's my color map. So it's not permanently damaging the image, which is really, really helpful. The next one that I'm going to recommend is to create a levels map. So let's go ahead and create a levels map. And we touched on levels in the previous tutorial. This just allows us to favor either black or white within our image. So for this label, I don't want it to be particularly shiny because it's a dirty old label, right? So it's going to be more matte, which means it's going to be more white. So let's have label to favor white. It's too much white. Let's favor dark and then turn white. Nope, I don't like that either. So I'm just kind of playing with the settings. Down here, I can really wash it out in the bottom. So there's some variation there. I don't want it to be too, oh, that's better. There we go. And then maybe I like that it's more washed out. And it may be still a little more white. There we go. So it'll be a little bit of shine, but this is largely going to be a white matte. Now that we have this set up, remember that these can be turned on and off. I'm going to create on a folder. I'm going to call this folder roughness, and I'm going to drag these both in it so that if I turn this on or off, it's essentially applying the filters that control the roughness map. Then I'm going to go File, Export, export as PNG, and we're going to call this can label roughness. All right. So then we go back into Substance Painter, and we have our food label loaded. Let's go ahead and activate the roughness map. Let's click on, oh, you know what I forgot to do? I forgot to load that roughness map in. Click on the plus sign for import resources, add resource, can label roughness. Let's label this as a texture. Let's ask it to be in our current session and import. And now under the roughness map, I'm going to type in, oh, I already typed in the word can, and there's the roughness map right there. Click. And now we see that there is no shine on that label. It's a very dirty old label. Might be too dark. I might want to go back in later and think about maybe allowing there to be a little bit of reflectivity. I think I do. Well, let me show you how to go back and change things if you want to. Let's go back to levels and let's gray this out a little. Too much gray, just enough to, there, I like that better. File, save as, oops, not save as, export. File, export, quick PNG. Let's replace the roughness map. Let's go back into Substance Painter. Close out, so I just kind of exited the roughness map, and I'm going to reload my resource. All right, so now I have two roughness maps in here, and I want to go for the darker one. That's a lot better. I feel better about that. It's got a little bit of shine to it, but not as shiny as the can. Let's take a look at our channels, and there is our roughness map. Instead of just being the aluminum can, now the can's label has its own roughness. And what's really cool is these spots right here. We type in M for material, you can actually see the aluminum can shining through the label. Isn't that neat? All right, next is our metalness map, and this one, very, very easy. I'm going to press F2 on my screen, and I'm going to go into my channels, and I'm looking for metal. Metal is not usually grayscale. It's either it is metal or it isn't metal. Okay, is a label metal? No, so it's going to be black. Very easy. Let's go back into Photoshop. Let's turn off the roughness, and let's create a new map. Or a new adjustment layer. Let's start by making this black and white. So we grabbed a new hue saturation, and then I think we just dropped the lightness. Boom. So we only needed one adjustment layer. Let's go ahead and still stick it in a folder, and this will be our metal adjustment map, or our adjustment layer. There we go. So here's color, here's roughness, here's metal. Cool. So I'm going to go ahead and go File. Where are you? Export as PNG. Can label underscore metal. And then let's go over here to Substance Painter. Let's go ahead and load our metal map. Find the path as a texture. Import the resource to current session. Import. And then let's go over here to our fill layer for the food label and change this to metal. And let's load our metal label. So that's what it looks like. Let's go and press M for material. And now you can see that label definitely doesn't look like it's made of aluminum anymore. Any vestige it had of looking like anything other than paper is gone. So now we've got this awesome paper texture on top of this metal can. All right, so now that we're done bringing in our label maps, I'm not going to worry about a height map at this time. We can talk about that in a later tutorial. Just focus on color, roughness, and metal. And let's go ahead and just start painting some texture on top of our can. Now that we got the label and the can, we can have some fun. I'm going to create just maybe a dirt layer. That could be fun. And there's a lot of options here. I'm going to close out of the word texture and just let's start with a brush. So first I'm going to kind of pick a brush where I feel like, oh, look at that. That dirt brush looks pretty good. Let's scale it up. If you want to scale up a brush, it's the bracket hotkeys next to the letter P. There you go. So right now this is only painting height map. Interesting. Let's press Control Z and see if we can't add some texture and material to this. So right now it's set to height mode. So it's painting depth. Let's go ahead and click on the material mode and see if we can't find something kind of dirt or rust-like. Let's try that. Let's try typing in rust. Oh, those look good. I kind of like this fine rust color. Let's start with that. Yeah, so now in addition to height, it's also painting the material. And we can go in and actually edit the attributes of this material. By default, it's kind of a red color. We could go in and change it to something more brown, maybe, or maybe a little lighter. Kind of like that. We could also turn it green if we want it to be slimy. There's you can just kind of go and explore the attributes that it allows you to change. So it looks like you can intensify the depth. So right now it's got a bit of height map attached to it. You can kind of push how much that is being in the parameters. Really something to just play with. But right now we have a material assigned that's rust, and it's going to affect all these channels in addition to just the default height of the brush. And when I paint, I can just slap some dirt on there. You know, in addition to the already dirty label, if I feel so inclined. All right, so what's some other stuff I could do? We also have dynamic brushes. Let's see if we can find one of those, like a particle brush. Oh, here's one, Leaks Heavy. Click on that. You'll notice that it's a particle brush because it's going to have this little icon at the bottom corner that tells you it's a particle brush. So I've got this particle brush selected. Let's go into material and choose a different material for this. I kind of like wonder if we got anything. See, we got a slime. No, not really. What have we got in here? Let's just scroll through and see what kind of materials there are. Something interesting. Ooh, lizard scales. That's kind of cool. Maybe no. There's wood. There's rust again. There's a different rust. Huh, that's kind of interesting. I could just build my own material if I wanted to, or just adjust something that looks kind of cool. But I just want to kind of play with what exists right now. So let's just go with, yeah, let's just stick with the rust and just play with some of its settings. We'll change the rust color to a green. Yeah. And then maybe, what does cavities do? Judging by the look of it, it's the depth of those pores. What if I turn cavities all the way off? Okay. What if we go in? I'm just experimenting. This is what I'd encourage you to do. Just experiment. Height position. Normal intensity. I don't know. Let's just paint with it. So when you paint with a particle brush, you just do a swipe. Oh, that looks terrible. I played with way too much in the way of height. Let's press undo. Control Z. All right, I'm going to reselect this. Let's start with something brand new. Get rid of the materials because that is just not working. Okay, so we're back to square one. It's brand new. Let's go back to the particle brush. So that was Leaks Heavy. Okay, and let's, instead of throwing a material on it, let's just throw a color on it. Let's just throw a cool green on it. Yeah, and just leave it as it is, but without the height. There we go. That looks pretty cool. Again, you could kind of put a material on there. I really just wanted to show you what these brushes do when you choose a particle-based brush. And there are options within the particle emitter itself that you can change, like, for example, spread and particle life. If you increase the particle life, like let's say I increase the particle life to 3, then it's going to drip down the can much longer. I can also increase the size of the particle. There's a lot of fun to be had with particle brushes. So that's another thing that you could experiment with. Really go ham with this. You know, choose any sort of brush that you think looks cool. If there are images you want to bring in and paint with, you can do that too. You could go back into Photoshop and further gunk up the map. This is just you exploring and learning all the ways that these brushes can have the final look of your can. So I encourage exploration. I put all of this on a separate layer, a paintable layer. So if I don't like it, I can always delete it and go back to square one. But essentially the important thing is we've learned how to put a smart material on our mesh in this tutorial. We learned how to go in and play with the attributes of those smart materials. And we learned how to use a fill layer to load in important maps pertaining to our label. Specifically, we did the color, the roughness, and the metallic. And then just going in with the final layer to add extra embellishments if you feel so inclined. And when you're done, save your scene. We will talk about how to render images of your food can in a later tutorial.